You know what the hardest part of getting old is? My son said that night, his voice calm as he reached for another slice of turkey. It's realizing when you've become a burden. The words floated across the Thanksgiving table like cold air slipping through a cracked window, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft clink of silverware against china. I remember staring at the candle in the center of the table, watching the flame tremble slightly, as if even it had heard what he'd just said. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite day of the year. Not Christmas, not birthdays. Thanksgiving. It was the one holiday that felt simple, honest. Just food, family, and gratitude. For nearly 30 years, this house had been the place where everyone gathered. The same oak dining table, the same cream-colored plates, the same recipe for roasted turkey I had perfected long before my son Daniel had even left for college. That morning I had woken up before sunrise, the way I always did on Thanksgiving. At 67, my body didn't really believe in sleeping late anymore. I brewed a pot of coffee, wrapped my cardigan around my shoulders, and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard dusted with a thin layer of November frost. The thermometer outside read 38 degrees. Cold, but not unusual for late November in Ohio. I remember smiling to myself as I began the quiet routine I'd done so many times before. Rinsing the turkey, preparing the stuffing, peeling potatoes while the morning news hummed softly from the television in the living room. By noon, the house smelled the way a Thanksgiving home should. Butter, sage, roasted turkey, and cinnamon from the pumpkin pies cooling on the counter. Daniel arrived around 3 in the afternoon with his wife Jessica and my grandson Ethan. Ethan ran inside first, his sneakers thudding against the hardwood floor, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. "Grandma!" he called out, throwing his arms around me with the kind of pure enthusiasm only a 12-year-old can still manage. Behind him came Daniel, tall like his father had been, his dark coat dusted with the cold outside air. Jessica followed quietly, carrying a glass dish of cranberry sauce she had probably picked up from the grocery store on the way over. The 4 of us sat down around the dining table. Just after 4. The candles were lit, the turkey was carved, and the plates were full. At first everything seemed normal. Ethan talked about his basketball practice. Jessica scrolled briefly through her phone before placing it face down beside her plate. Daniel asked if I still kept the thermostat at 72 like always. I laughed and said some habits never change. But looking back now, I realized there was something strange about the way Jessica kept glancing at Daniel. The way they seemed to be waiting for something. Waiting for the right moment. I poured gravy over Daniel's mashed potatoes the way I had done since he was a boy, and for a second I saw the child he used to be. The boy who once built a snow fort in this backyard and ran inside shouting for hot chocolate. Then Daniel cleared his throat. He set his fork down. And that's when he said it. "Mom," he began, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, "we need to talk about something." Jessica folded her hands on the table, her eyes fixed on her plate. Ethan stopped chewing and looked between us, confused. Daniel took a slow breath before continuing. "You know we love you," he said, though something about the sentence sounded oddly distant. "But lately things have been getting harder." I didn't say anything. I just waited. The room felt smaller somehow, the warm glow of the candles suddenly too bright. Then Daniel said the words that would change everything. "Mom, you've become a burden." For a moment the entire table went silent. Even the old wall clock in the kitchen seemed to pause between ticks. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly looked back down at his plate. Jessica reached for her glass of water, though she didn't drink from it. And me? I simply smiled. Not the kind of smile people give when they're happy. The kind of smile people give when they finally understand something they should have seen much sooner. Daniel's words did not explode the way cruel words sometimes do. They landed softly, almost politely, and somehow that made them heavier. I kept the same small smile on my face while I slowly set my fork down beside my plate. The turkey had already gone cold on my dish, though only a few minutes had passed. "A burden," I repeated quietly, as if I had not quite heard him correctly. Daniel nodded once, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, we have been talking about this for a while," he said carefully. "It is just things are different now." I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind us, and the old wall clock finally resumed its ticking, each second sounding louder than usual. Jessica cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table like someone about to present a business proposal. "We just think it might be time to consider some changes," she said gently, though the softness in her voice felt practiced. "The house is big. Maintaining it must be a lot for you." I looked around the dining room slowly. The same pale yellow walls Daniel had helped me paint when he was 16. The same oak cabinets that still held the Thanksgiving dishes I had collected one by one over decades. The place where every birthday candle had been blown out, every Christmas morning photographed, every scraped knee comforted. "Hard to maintain," she said. Perhaps it was. But no one had asked me that before. Ethan shifted in his chair and glanced up at his father. "Dad," he said uncertainly, though Daniel gave him a quick look that seemed to say not now. Daniel took another breath and continued. "Mom, the truth is that we worry about you living here alone," he said. "And honestly, with the cost of things these days, it might make more sense if you moved somewhere smaller. Maybe a senior community. Or even an apartment closer to us." I noticed he did not say with us. That word was carefully missing. Jessica nodded quickly. "There are beautiful places," she added. "Places with activities, other people your age, maintenance included. You would not have to worry about mowing the lawn or fixing things anymore." The irony of that almost made me laugh. I had mowed that lawn for 20 years after Daniel's father passed away. The old push mower had rattled like a shopping cart with a loose wheel, but it always did the job. "I see," I said calmly. I picked up my napkin and wiped my hands slowly, giving myself time to think. Daniel seemed relieved that I was not raising my voice or arguing. Perhaps that was what he expected. But arguing requires surprise, and the truth was something inside me had already begun connecting pieces I had ignored for months. The sudden questions about my finances. The way Daniel had asked about the property taxes last spring. Jessica casually mentioning how much houses in the neighborhood were selling for these days. At the time, I had believed they were simply making conversation. Now the puzzle finally looked complete. Daniel leaned forward again. "The house could sell for a lot right now," he said, lowering his voice as if the walls might hear. "The market is strong. If you sold it, you would have money for years. It would take the pressure off everyone." Everyone. That word hung quietly between us. I looked at him, then really looked at him. The same brown eyes he had as a boy, though now they carried the impatience of someone who believed he was being practical. For a brief moment, I wondered if he even realized how his words sounded, or if this had all seemed perfectly reasonable in his mind. Ethan quietly pushed his peas around his plate with a fork, pretending not to listen, though children always hear more than adults think. Jessica finally took a sip of her water and spoke again. "We are only trying to help," she said softly. "You deserve an easier life." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them slightly uncomfortable. Then I folded my hands in my lap and gave Daniel the calmest answer I could possibly offer. "You are right," I said. "Things are going to change." Daniel's shoulders relaxed almost instantly, as if a heavy conversation had just been successfully completed. Jessica even smiled faintly. But what they did not understand yet was that I had not said whose plan we were about to follow. I let the conversation drift back to safer topics after that. Ethan talked about a science project he was building for school, something about solar panels and small motors. Jessica complimented the pumpkin pie, though she asked if I had used less sugar this year. Daniel poured himself another glass of iced tea and checked his phone once or twice, the way people do when they believe the most difficult part of the evening is already behind them. I nodded, smiled when appropriate, and passed the cranberry sauce when someone asked for it. From the outside, nothing about that Thanksgiving dinner would have seemed unusual. But inside my mind, something had shifted quietly into place, the way a lock turns with a soft click when the right key finally slides in. I had spent most of my life thinking that family decisions were built on conversations, patience, and love. That night I realized something different. Sometimes people arrive at decisions long before they invite you to the table. The dinner ended around 6:30. Ethan helped me carry the empty plates to the kitchen, stacking them carefully beside the sink. He was a thoughtful boy, the kind who noticed small things. "Grandma, do you want me to dry the dishes?" he asked, already rolling up the sleeves of his sweatshirt. I smiled and shook my head. "You are a guest today," I told him gently. "Guests do not do dishes on Thanksgiving." He grinned and ran back to the living room where the television had been turned on. A football game filled the house with the familiar sound of announcers and cheering crowds. Daniel stood near the coat rack pulling on his jacket while Jessica gathered their things. I could hear them speaking quietly near the front door, their voices low but relieved, as if they believed the conversation had gone better than expected. When Daniel returned to the kitchen doorway, he leaned casually against the frame. "Mom," he said, "I am glad you took that so well earlier. I know it is not easy to talk about things like that." I rinsed a plate under warm water, watching the steam rise slowly from the sink. "Life has a way of making things clear eventually," I answered calmly. Daniel nodded, apparently satisfied with that response. "We can start looking at some places next week," he added. Jessica found a few communities about 15 minutes from our house. "They look really nice." I dried my hands on a towel and turned toward him. "Next week might be a little soon," I said. "There are a few things I need to handle first." Daniel shrugged. "Sure, of course. But the sooner we list the house, the better the price will be." Again that quiet word slipped into the air. List. As if the decision had already been signed somewhere. I did not argue. I simply walked him to the front door the way I had done hundreds of times before. The evening air outside had grown colder. My porch light cast a pale circle across the driveway where their car waited. Ethan hugged me tightly before climbing into the back seat. "Bye, Grandma," he said. "I will call you tomorrow." Jessica offered a polite smile and thanked me for dinner. Daniel gave me a quick hug, the kind people give when they are already thinking about the drive home. "We will talk soon," he said. I stood on the porch as their car pulled away, the red taillights fading slowly down the quiet street. The neighborhood looked peaceful the way it always did after Thanksgiving dinner, with soft lights glowing in the windows of nearby houses, and the faint smell of fireplaces drifting through the cold air. When I finally stepped back inside, the house felt larger than it had earlier that evening. Not emptier, just clearer somehow. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly into the living room, where the old wooden desk sat near the window. Inside its top drawer were documents most people forget about until the day they suddenly matter. Insurance papers, bank records, the deed to the house. I sat down in the chair and pulled the drawer open. For a long moment I simply looked at the neat stack of folders resting inside. Then I reached for the phone sitting on the desk and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. It belonged to someone Daniel did not even remember meeting 15 years ago. Someone who specialized in making sure plans changed exactly the way they should. The phone rang once, then twice. When the voice on the other end answered, I spoke calmly. "Hello, this is Margaret Carter," I said. "I believe it is time for us to review my estate plan." I slept well that night, which surprised me. Most people would expect anger or heartbreak to keep someone awake after hearing words like the ones Daniel had spoken. But my mind felt strangely calm. When morning arrived, a thin line of winter sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains and landed across the same wooden table where we had eaten the night before. The house smelled faintly of leftover turkey and cinnamon. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching a few brown leaves tumble across the backyard lawn. The thermometer outside read 41 degrees, a little warmer than the day before. It felt like the beginning of a different season. At 9:30 in the morning my phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name I had expected to see. "Good morning, Margaret," the voice said warmly when I answered. "This is Thomas Reynolds." Thomas Reynolds had been my attorney for nearly 15 years. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, asked thoughtful questions, and never rushed a conversation. I had first met him after my husband Robert passed away unexpectedly. Back then, I had needed help organizing the small pieces of a life that suddenly felt too large for one person to carry. "Good morning, Thomas," I replied calmly. "I hope I did not interrupt your holiday weekend." He chuckled softly. "Not at all. I am actually in the office catching up on a few things. When you called last night, I suspected something important had come up." I looked out the window again for a moment before speaking. "You could say that," I answered. "I would like to review my will, my property deed, and any arrangements connected to my estate." There was a brief pause on the line, not surprised but attentive. "Of course," Thomas said. "Has something changed in your family situation?" I thought about Daniel sitting at my dining table the night before, carefully explaining how my life should become smaller for the convenience of everyone else. Yes, I said simply. Something has become very clear. Thomas suggested we meet in person the following afternoon at his office downtown. His building stood about 20 minutes from my house, just past the old courthouse square. I agreed and thanked him before hanging up. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I wrapped the leftover turkey in foil, placed containers in the refrigerator, and washed the dishes that had been left in the drying rack overnight. Around 11 o'clock, Ethan called just like he had promised. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked immediately, his voice carrying that honest concern children rarely hide. I smiled as I leaned back in the kitchen chair. "Of course I am okay," I told him gently. "Why would you ask that?" There was a small hesitation on the other end of the line. "Because of what Dad said yesterday," he admitted. It sounded mean. Children have a way of noticing truth, without dressing it in polite language. Sometimes adults try to solve problems in ways that do not sound very kind, I said carefully. But do not worry. Everything will work out the way it should. Ethan seemed satisfied with that answer. After a few more minutes talking about his basketball practice, we said goodbye. In the early afternoon, I went upstairs and opened the closet in the guest's bedroom. Inside sat 3 old boxes filled with photographs, letters, and documents I had not looked at in years. I carried them downstairs and placed them on the living room floor beside the coffee table. Slowly, I began sorting through them. Pictures of Daniel as a boy covered in grass stains after Little League games. School report cards with careful red pin notes from teachers. Christmas cards from relatives who had long since passed away. Each photograph reminded me of something simple but important. This house had never been just a building. It had been a witness to an entire life. By the time the sun began to lower behind the maple trees outside, the decision forming in my mind felt steady and certain. The next afternoon I would sit across from Thomas Reynolds and make a few changes. Quiet changes. The kind that did not require arguments at a dinner table. The kind that simply rewrote the future without asking permission from anyone who had already decided I was a burden. I arrived at Thomas Reynolds's office the next afternoon a little before 2 o'clock. The drive downtown took about 20 minutes just as he had said, and the sky above the courthouse square was a pale winter blue with thin clouds drifting slowly across it. His office was on the 3rd floor of an older brick building that had probably been standing there for more than 100 years. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where quiet decisions had been made for generations. Thomas greeted me personally when I stepped through the glass door. He was a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair, and the calm expression of someone who had spent most of his career listening carefully before speaking. "Margaret, it is good to see you," he said warmly as he shook my hand. "Please come in." His office overlooked the town square where a few bare trees stood beside a fountain that had already been turned off for the winter. I settled into the chair across from his desk while he opened a thin leather folder and placed a yellow legal pad beside it. "Now," he said gently, "tell me what you would like to review." I folded my hands in my lap and spoke without hesitation. "I would like to update my will and the distribution of my estate," I said. Thomas nodded slowly, writing a few notes. "That is certainly possible. Your current will was written about 8 years ago. At that time you left the house and the majority of your assets to your son Daniel, with a small trust established for your grandson Ethan." I remembered signing those papers. At the time it had felt like the natural order of things. Parents leave their homes to their children. Families continue forward. But life sometimes reveals details that paperwork cannot predict. "I would like to make several changes," I continued. Thomas looked up with quiet attention. "Go on." I took a slow breath. "First, I want the house placed in a trust that will transfer directly to Ethan when he turns 25 years old." Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly, not with disapproval but with interest. "And Daniel?" he asked. I gave a small thoughtful smile. "Daniel will still receive something," I said. "But not the house." Thomas tapped his pen lightly against the paper. "You understand that this will significantly change the structure of your estate." "Yes," I replied calmly. "That is exactly the point." The room remained quiet for a moment except for the faint sound of traffic drifting up from the street below. Then Thomas asked the question that experienced attorneys often ask when important decisions are made. Would you like to explain your reasoning for the record? I considered that carefully. Let us simply say that I want my home to go to someone who still understands what it means, I said. Thomas nodded once, apparently satisfied with that answer. He began outlining the legal steps required to create the trust and revise the rest of my documents. The process would take a few days to prepare properly, but once signed it would be fully binding. There is one more thing, I added as he finished writing. Thomas looked up again. Yes. I glanced toward the window where the afternoon sun had begun slipping behind the courthouse roofline. I would also like to appoint you as the executor who oversees the transition when the time eventually comes, I said. I want everything handled exactly as written. Thomas closed the folder and offered a calm, reassuring smile. Margaret, that is what I am here for. When I left his office an hour later, the air outside had turned colder, somewhere around 39 degrees according to the bank sign across the street. I walked slowly back to my car, feeling the crisp winter air against my face. Nothing about the town had changed since the day before. The same quiet streets, the same familiar buildings. Yet something inside my life had quietly shifted direction. Daniel believed we were about to begin selling my house and arranging my future. What he did not realize was that the future had already been rewritten the moment he decided I was a burden. I spent the next few days moving through my routine the way I always had, but something inside me felt lighter, almost as if a long unanswered question had finally found its answer. On Monday morning I watered the small plants by the kitchen window, the same ones I had kept alive for nearly a decade. Outside, the sky was gray, and the temperature hovered around 42 degrees. A thin wind pushed dry leaves across the driveway, gathering them in quiet corners along the fence. Around noon my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. He asked if I had thought more about the next steps for the house. I could almost hear the careful tone he used when typing those words, the same tone he had used at the dinner table. I replied simply that I was considering everything and would let him know soon. That answer seemed to satisfy him for the moment. Later that afternoon I drove to the grocery store a few miles away. The place was busier than usual because people were still buying leftovers and discounted holiday food. As I pushed my cart slowly down the aisle, I realized how many ordinary moments had quietly filled my life over the years. Choosing apples, comparing the price of coffee, greeting the same cashier who had worked there since Daniel was a teenager. Life had never been extravagant, but it had always been steady. When I returned home, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. For a moment I thought perhaps Daniel had stopped by unexpectedly, but as I walked up the front steps the car drove away. It was only a neighbor turning around in the cul-de-sac. Still, the moment made me think about how quickly assumptions can shape the way people see the world. Daniel had already imagined my future in a smaller apartment, closer to his house, easier for everyone else to manage. What he had not imagined was that I might have a different plan entirely. On Wednesday afternoon Thomas Reynolds called to confirm that the revised documents were ready. He explained that the trust arrangement for the house had been drafted carefully, so that Ethan would inherit it when he reached 25 years old. Until that time the property would remain protected, maintained through the estate. Everything is exactly as you requested, he said calmly. You can come by tomorrow to sign the final paperwork. I thanked him and wrote the appointment time on a small notepad beside the phone. That evening, as the sun set behind the maple trees in the backyard, the house felt unusually peaceful. The living room lamp cast a soft yellow light across the photographs I had sorted earlier in the week. One picture caught my attention. Daniel was about 8 years old in that photograph, standing proudly beside a crooked snowman we had built together one winter afternoon. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his smile was wide and genuine. Looking at that picture did not make me angry. If anything, it reminded me that people do not become strangers overnight. They change slowly through years of choices and assumptions. Sometimes they forget the simple kindness that once guided them. The next morning I returned to Thomas's office and signed the documents that would quietly reshape everything Daniel believed about the future. The pen moved smoothly across the paper as I wrote my name, each signature sealing a decision that no one else had been invited to influence. When it was finished, Thomas placed the papers neatly back into the folder. It is done, he said. I nodded, feeling a calm certainty settle over me. Daniel would eventually learn about these changes, but not today and not tomorrow. Some truths arrive slowly, the way winter does, one cold morning at a time, until the landscape looks completely different. The days that followed moved quietly, almost peacefully, as December slowly began to settle over the town. The temperature dropped into the mid-30s most mornings, and a thin layer of frost appeared on the grass behind my house before the sun rose high enough to melt it away. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. I watered the plants, read the morning newspaper, and took short walks around the neighborhood whenever the weather allowed it. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside my mind, everything felt settled in a way it had not for a long time. Daniel called again that Friday evening. His voice sounded upbeat, almost cheerful, as if he believed we were working toward the same plan. "Mom, Jessica found a real estate agent who specializes in houses in your neighborhood," he said. "Apparently homes on your street have been selling fast. One place about 2 blocks away sold for almost $400,000 last month." I listened quietly while he spoke. He continued explaining how the process would work, mentioning inspections, paperwork, and possible timelines for listing the property. The confidence in his voice suggested that he had already imagined the entire future unfolding exactly the way he expected. When he finally paused, I answered calmly. "Daniel, I appreciate you thinking about these things," I said. "But I am not ready to talk to a real estate agent yet." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Not ready?" he repeated. "Mom, the market is strong right now. Waiting might cost you money." I smiled faintly even though he could not see me. "Money has never been the most important thing about this house," I replied. Daniel sighed softly, the way people do when they believe someone older is being stubborn. "I just want to make sure you are taken care of," he said. "That is all." I did not argue with him. Instead, I told him I would think about everything carefully, and that we would discuss it again soon. When the call ended, the house returned to its usual quiet. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled across the neighborhood. A few days later, Ethan came to visit on his own. Daniel had dropped him off after school while he ran errands across town. Ethan stepped inside carrying his backpack and immediately headed for the kitchen the way he always had since he was little. "Grandma, do you still have those chocolate chip cookies?" he asked hopefully. I laughed and opened the cookie jar on the counter. "Of course I do," I said. We sat together at the kitchen table while he told me about school, his basketball team, and a science test he had just finished. Listening to him reminded me how quickly time moves. It felt like only yesterday that Daniel had been the same age, sitting at this same table with the same hopeful energy in his voice. After a few minutes, Ethan looked around the kitchen thoughtfully. "Dad says you might sell the house," he said. The words were simple, spoken with curiosity rather than judgment. I took a slow sip of my tea before answering. "Your father and I have talked about a lot of possibilities," I said gently. Ethan nodded but continued studying the room. "I like it here," he admitted. "It feels like a real home." His comment stayed with me long after Daniel returned to pick him up that evening. As their car drove away, I stood at the front window watching the headlights fade down the street. It struck me then how often people confuse convenience with wisdom. Daniel believed he was solving a problem by shrinking my world into something easier to manage. What he had not considered was that sometimes the best solution is not to make life smaller, but to protect the parts of it that still matter. And now, quietly and carefully, that protection was already in place. December continued to unfold quietly across the town, bringing shorter days and colder evenings. By the second week of the month, the temperature rarely climbed above 38 degrees, and thin patches of frost stayed on the sidewalks well into the late morning. I had begun decorating the house for Christmas the way I always did, though this year I moved a little slower, taking more time with each ornament. The old artificial tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches holding decades of memories in the form of small decorations collected over the years. Some ornaments were simple glass spheres, while others carried tiny handwritten labels from long ago. One of them still read, "Daniel age 7" in faded blue ink. I placed that ornament carefully near the center of the tree and stepped back for a moment. It struck me again how much of a life can be contained within the walls of a single home. One afternoon a few days later, Daniel called once more. His voice carried a trace of impatience this time, though he tried to keep it polite. Mom, Jessica spoke with that real estate agent again, he said. He believes your house could easily sell before the new year if we list it soon. I leaned back in my chair near the window, watching a light snow begin to drift down across the backyard. Daniel, I said calmly, I told you I am still thinking about things. He hesitated, then spoke more directly. Mom, I do not understand why you are delaying this. We talked about it at Thanksgiving. You said things were going to change. His words reminded me of the quiet moment at the dinner table when I had spoken that exact sentence. At the time he believed it meant I had accepted his plan. Yes, I replied gently. I did say that. There was a long pause on the line before he answered again. Then why does it feel like nothing is happening? I smiled slightly as I watched the snowflakes gathering on the wooden fence behind the house. Sometimes important changes happen quietly, I said. They do not always look the way people expect. Daniel did not respond right away. I could almost imagine him standing in his kitchen, trying to decide whether to push the conversation further or let it rest. Finally he sighed. All right, he said. Just let me know when you are ready. After we ended the call, the house returned to its peaceful silence. The snow continued falling for another hour, leaving a thin white layer across the yard and the rooftops along the street. That evening Ethan called again. His voice sounded excited, the way children sound when winter finally begins to show itself. Grandma, it is snowing here too, he said. Dad says we might get 2 inches tonight. I laughed softly. That is enough to build a small snowman, I told him. We spoke for several minutes about school and the approaching Christmas break. Before hanging up, Ethan said something that lingered in my thoughts long afterward. Grandma, he said, when I am older I want to have a house like yours. The kind where everyone feels welcome. After the call ended I sat quietly in the living room for a long time, watching the lights on the Christmas tree reflect softly against the window glass. Daniel believed the house represented a problem that needed solving. Ethan saw it as something worth protecting. The difference between those two views felt more important than any conversation about real estate or convenience. Outside, the snow stopped falling and the night grew still. Somewhere down the street a neighbor's porch light clicked on, casting a warm glow across the quiet neighborhood. Inside my house, the tree lights continued to shine softly, illuminating the same walls that had witnessed years of laughter, learning, and growth. And though Daniel did not realize it yet, the future of this house had already been decided in a way that would honor the person who still understood what a real home truly meant. I woke up the morning before Christmas Eve to the quiet sound of snow sliding gently from the roof outside my bedroom window. Overnight the town had been covered in a fresh layer of white, and the backyard looked peaceful in the pale winter light. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 29 degrees, the coldest morning we had seen so far that winter. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood by the window for a moment, watching the faint steam rise from my mug. The house felt warm and calm, the way it always had during the holidays. The Christmas tree lights were still glowing softly in the living room from the night before. That afternoon Daniel called again. His tone was different this time, less patient than before. Mom, we really need to figure out what is happening with the house, he said. The real estate agent says buyers are already looking in your neighborhood. I sat at the dining table where our Thanksgiving dinner had taken place only a few weeks earlier. Daniel, I said calmly, you seem very focused on selling this house. Because it makes sense, he replied quickly. You would have money, less responsibility, and you could live somewhere closer to us. I paused before answering, letting the silence stretch just long enough for my words to settle properly when they arrived. I already made some arrangements about the house, I said. On the other end of the line his voice sharpened slightly with curiosity. Arrangements? What kind of arrangements? I looked toward the living room where the Christmas tree stood quietly beside the window, its ornaments reflecting the afternoon light. I updated my estate plan, I explained. There was a brief pause before Daniel spoke again. Estate plan, he repeated. Mom, you do not need to worry about that right now. What matters is what happens while you are still living here. I smiled faintly. What happens later is exactly why I made the changes, I replied gently. His tone became more serious. What changes? He asked. I folded my hands together on the table and answered simply. The house will not be sold, I said. It will stay in the family. Daniel seemed relieved for a moment. Well, that is good, he said. Eventually it would come to me anyway. I shook my head slowly even though he could not see the gesture. No, Daniel, I said calmly. It will go to Ethan when he turns 25. The silence that followed was longer than any pause we had shared before. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of surprise and confusion. You gave the house to Ethan? He asked. Why would you do that? I looked around the room once more, taking in the quiet walls that had watched my family grow through the years. Because he understands what this home means, I said softly. Daniel did not respond right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the phone, processing words he had clearly not expected to hear. Finally he spoke again, more carefully this time. Mom, that does not seem fair, he said. I thought we were trying to solve a problem together. I let out a quiet breath and answered with the calm certainty that had grown inside me since Thanksgiving. Daniel, I said, the moment you called me a burden at my own table, the problem became very clear. The line remained silent for several seconds. Outside the window, snowflakes had begun falling again, drifting slowly through the gray afternoon sky. I continued speaking gently. You were right about one thing, I said. Things did need to change. I looked at the Christmas tree lights glowing softly across the living room and allowed a small, peaceful smile to form. And now they have.